Okay guys, hear me out. Jurassic Acid Trip 64.
But sir, that's just a dinosaur.
But, yep. But there's more. Also, time portals. Takes you through the universe, space, time, different dimensions. And
But what happened to the lights?
aliens. On top of that, there's going to be tons of crazy weapons, multiple ways to kill and disembowel your enemies, spill their blood all over the place, whether it is humanoid, dinosaur, bug, whatever you want. And it's for kids. And somehow that worked. Not worked as in Turok became some weird little cult game that a handful of people remember. Turok became a legitimate, important gaming franchise. The first game, Turok Dinosaur Hunter, here, arrived on the Nintendo 64 in 1997, developed by Iguana Entertainment and published by Acclaim. And it arrived at a really interesting moment for the Nintendo 64. It was still young, first-person shooters were still more associated with PCs, and here comes this violent, bizarre game about dinosaurs, ancient sci-fi ruins, futuristic weapons, and warrior fighters. And this warrior has to fight his way through something called the Lost Lands on Nintendo's console, and people bought in. By 2002, Acclaim was describing Turok as a franchise that had moved more than 6 million units and generated more than $250 million in worldwide sales. So when we ask, why did Turok disappear? That's what makes this story interesting. We're not asking why some obscure project failed, some experiment disappeared. We're asking how this successful game lost its place in gaming that it deserved. And with that, that brings me into chapter 1. Turok was lightning in a bottle. I think this is the first reason Turok became as big as it did, and it's actually a pretty simple one. There was nothing else quite like it. Dinosaurs, aliens, ancient temples, sci-fi technology, the ridiculous weapons, jungles, portals, all mashed together into this completely insane universe that somehow felt like it belonged together, almost like it was seamless. That's actually why I wanted to open the video the way that I did. If somebody walked into a conference room today and pitched all of those ideas at once, you'd think they'd get turned down and promptly fired. The developers of Turok basically said no. Write that all down, and that's what the identity of Turok became. And especially if you were a kid when you play them and you go back as an adult and play these games again instead of just remembering them, you realize that just how weird they are in a good way. The original Dinosaur Hunter dropped you into these huge environments filled with enemies, traps, puzzles, keys, different weapons, of course, places to explore, mini games, and it was simply pushing you through a cinematic hallway, one thing after another, constantly the entire time, and you had to pay attention or you were going to miss things or you were going to die. And then Turok 2 Seeds of Evil took that philosophy and basically said, okay, but bigger. I'm replaying Seeds of Evil right now for the first time in years, and I genuinely forgot how enormous some of these places feel, and there's so much that I don't remember. I get lost all the time. I have no idea where the hell I'm going. 90% of the time still. I'm just kind of trying to flow through the map. But honestly, that's the part I missed about these games. One of the parts I missed about these games is they weren't afraid to let you explore, or to let you get lost, or find something because you decided to look behind the quote-unquote wrong wall, or go down some path that didn't immediately stick out and have some giant glowing arrow pointing right there saying, here, this is where the mystery is, come find it. This let you keep the mystery an actual mystery and the discovery real discovery. And then there were the weapons, because apparently regular guns weren't enough. Even though the shotgun was like my second favorite, Seeds of Evil eventually gives you something called the cerebral bore, which I unfortunately don't have footage of right here. But this weapon's entire design philosophy appears to have been, what if we made a heat-seeking drill bomb that attaches directly to the enemy's skull, drills into it, and explodes?
And imagining the same team that had the idea of Turok pitched to them, when they heard this, they probably said,
Hell yes!
ship it, now. Because, I mean, that's Turok. It had identity. It had a feel. You could look at this game for 5 seconds and know that you weren't playing GoldenEye, you weren't playing Doom, you weren't playing a generic military shooter, you were indeed playing Turok. Chapter 2. Success wasn't the problem. And this is where I think the story of Turok gets a little muddy or misrepresented, because Turok didn't explode in 1997 and then immediately die. That's not what happened. That's not how it went. Dinosaur Hunter was followed with Seeds of Evil in 1998, then Rage Wars in 99, then Turok 3, Shadow of Oblivion in 2000, and finally, under Acclaim, Turok Evolution in 2002. And if you ask me, that's a lot of Turok for 5 years to think that it wasn't being successful. Not every game in the franchise performed like the original, though, and that's to be expected. Not every experiment they did landed, but Acclaim clearly continued investing heavily into Turok. This was not some franchise they had just forgotten about. By the time Evolution was being marketed in 2002, Acclaim itself was still calling Turok a blockbuster franchise. Again, more than 6 million units. More than 250 million in worldwide sales. Turok was one of the properties that this company had built itself around. Nintendo would later report on, but it was kind of obvious to see. So if success wasn't the problem, what was? And that's pretty much the entire shooter genre.
So in the late 90s and early 2000s were absolutely brutal if you were trying to keep a shooter franchise relevant. You were trying to keep it alive. Because the genre was evolving incredibly fast, as shown here. GoldenEye 007 had already transformed players' standards. It had already set new expectations. And then Medal of Honor, arriving in 1999, gave players an expectation to have cinematic, more scripted stories and campaigns instead of traveling around and getting lost like Turok provides. Then, in 2001, Halo. I don't know if younger players can fully appreciate just what Halo did to the shooter genre, just how enormous Halo was for gaming in general, and how Halo became a defining reason to even own a console. It also helped and establish what controls FPS shooters use, and we still use those controls today. Multiplayer became a bigger and bigger part of what players expected, just at a baseline level. Players are expecting multiplayer at split screen in every game now. The things that made Turok work for Acclaim were no longer working. The technical things that Turok had that made it impressive were no longer making it impressive. 5 years. Now 5 years. It might not sound like much, but in gaming, 5 years may as well be 50 years. Turok is no longer competing against the graphics, gameplay, and controls of 1997. The bar has been moved dramatically higher. And in 2002, Turok had the answer with Turok Evolution, which I unfortunately don't have any gameplay of.
Chapter 4. Evolution couldn't reset the clock. Now here's where nostalgia makes this complicated for me, personally. Because I like Turok Evolution. I grew up with it. So I'm not going to sit here 24 years later and pretend I hated something that younger me genuinely enjoyed. But liking a game and believing it was competitive with the absolute best shooters of 2002 are just two very different things. Evolution received mixed reviews, like most games. Critics found things to like, but complaints included some technical inconsistencies, some uneven gameplay in certain parts, and the infamous flying sections. And some contemporary reviews explicitly compared it unfavorably with games like Halo. It wasn't universally considered some catastrophic, unplayable disaster, but it wasn't the game that was going to redefine shooters and put Turok back ahead of the rest in the genre. And that's the brutal part of the industry, of most industries. Sometimes being fine, not always, sometimes, keyword, is worse than being terrible because nobody remembers fine. When the competition is redefining what people think a shooter can be, Turok needed to be another Dinosaur Hunter moment. Another game that made people look at it and say, holy shit, I haven't played anything like this. But Evolution didn't do that. But let's all be real for a second. Even if Evolution did better, Turok had much bigger problems. More than Halo. Because the company behind it was falling apart at the seams. Chapter 5. The Collapse of Acclaim. Acclaim had been one of the recognizable names in gaming throughout the 90s, but by the early 2000s, the company was in serious financial trouble. Losses mounted, debt became a problem, and in 2004, Acclaim filed for bankruptcy. Very unfortunate. Think about how quickly that happened from Turok's perspective. If we want to get a little, breaking the fourth wall here. In 2002, Acclaim was publicly promoting Evolution as the next entry in the franchise. It said it had generated more than $250 million. Roughly 2 years later, Acclaim was finished. Sometimes a franchise disappears because nobody wants it anymore, and sometimes, again unfortunately, the company keeping it alive disappears first. But therein lies a important distinction for Turok. Turok simply didn't get voted out of gaming by players. The entire corporate structure that had developed and published these games collapsed underneath it. The Acclaim era of Turok was over. But Turok itself, as an IP, wasn't dead. 4 years later, somebody tried again. Chapter 6. The reboot lost its identity. 4 years after Acclaim collapsed, Turok came back. But this wasn't Acclaim's Turok anymore, and it was easy to see. The 2008 reboot was developed by Propaganda Games and published by Disney Interactive Studios under Touchstone label. So that meant new developers, new continuity, new Turok, and a very different identity. Now, this is where I'm separating history from my opinion because I played this game, I finished this game, and there are things I genuinely liked about it. Hunting dinosaurs with a bow, cool. Getting up close with a knife, cool. Watching dinosaurs absolutely wreck people, still cool. But when I played it, something just always felt off. Think back to what made the original game stand out. The Lost Land. Ancient civilization mixed with sci-fi fiction, portals and aliens, completely ridiculous weapons. Vast exploration for its time. And Turok had been this bizarre collision of ideas that shouldn't have worked together, but it did. Then look at 2008. Joseph Turok is now a former member of an elite military unit sent with a squad to capture this former commander on an alien planet. There's still dinosaurs and there's still sci-fi fiction elements. You have the bow, you're still Turok. So I don't think it's fair to say they removed everything that made Turok recognizable, but the overall tone to me, it felt much closer to military squad-based shooters that were dominating that era. Instead of asking, what makes Turok different? It felt like this game was asking, how does Turok fit into what shooters are right now? And for me, that's where it lost me. And personally, I hated the aiming. The gunplay never felt right to me. The campaign was far more straightforward than Turok games that I remembered, and while there was absolutely moments I enjoyed, I never got the same feeling as stepping into some mysterious world and wondering, what the hell am I going to find next or do next? It felt like I was playing a shooter that happened to have dinosaurs in it, rather than playing Turok. If you've heard people talk about 2008 and say it bombed as well, like I am, That's really not what happened. The game did ship more than 1 million copies worldwide within the first couple of months. It did well enough that work actually began on another Turok. So despite mixed reviews, Turok wasn't necessarily dead, and there was supposed to be more from this studio. Chapter 7. And then, nothing. A sequel did enter development at Propaganda Games, like I said, but in early 2009, layoffs hit the studio, and the unannounced Turok sequel was canceled before it even got started. Contemporary reports tied the cancellation to layoffs affecting roughly 70 employees, and that's where the story almost cruelly is repeating itself. The original era of Turok ends after Acclaim collapsed, and somebody else decides to bring it back. A sequel starts moving forward, and that disappears too. Not because of the game itself, not because it suddenly stopped being cool, not because nobody bought Turok, but because once again the business surrounding Turok changed underneath it. It didn't have a foundation. And after years of that, nothing. The new classics eventually found a new life through remasters, and people keep playing them. Kept playing them, rather. Sorry, like I am right here in this clip. But as far as major Turok games, the series that had once been one of Acclaim's flagship properties, it was gone and has been gone. And now looking back at the entire story, I don't think there's one answer to why Turok disappeared. It was a chain reaction. The original game found success because Turok had an identity unlike almost anything else. The FPS genre evolved at an absurd pace. Evolution couldn't create another breakthrough moment. Acclaim collapsed because of it. A completely different team rebooted the franchise. That reboot changed much of the tone and identity that longtime Turok fans associated with Turok. And just when another game might have continued in that direction, at least, for the new fans, that sequel was canceled too. So Turok didn't die once, it basically died twice. The Acclaim era of Turok died. Propaganda reboot era of Turok, it also died. And then, after all these years, this happened. Turok Origins, a completely new Turok game from Saber Interactive. So basically, I like to imagine this. Somebody walked into a conference room and said, okay, hear me out. Jurassic Acid 26. They said, what? He said, listen to me, dinosaurs, aliens, portals. And the development team, the investment team, they all said,
You son of a bitch, I'm in.
So why did Turok disappear? The industry changed, the game struggled to keep pace, the game collapsed, and when Turok finally came back to something that at least to me didn't feel like Turok. Then it disappeared all over again. But now, we get another chance, and I can't wait. I've waited a long time for this, so Saber, you have my attention and many others. Please don't mess this up. And guys, if you enjoyed this video, it took me a tremendous amount of time. I have never put this much effort into a video I've made, ever. And if you want to follow along when Origins comes out and play through it with me, please subscribe. Feel free to like or dislike the video, leave a comment for engagement, anything helps. I appreciate anybody who stayed this long, and I look forward to seeing y'all in Origins.